Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture at the John Snow Theatre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My name is Jeff Vaga. I'm the director of the London International Development Centre, and I have a small initial role here of welcoming you to a very special LIDC 3IE seminar, which will be presented by Howard White. There are many who will follow me and talk about Howard, so I'm simply going to make one small point. LIDC, as some of you know, is a collaboration between colleges here in the University of London to work on interdisciplinary problems in international development. And we're delighted that one of our functions is to host the London office of 3IE. And I should say that the reason we are doing that is because Howard White had the vision a number of years ago that the London office of 3IE should sit in an academic setting. And we've benefited enormously from that decision. And it's been a great collaboration since. Evaluation of development programs is a key topic for many of our 2,000 academic, student, and alumni members here in LIDC in London. And we have organized now, this is our 37th 3IE LIDC seminar, a rather particular one, and I should say, and appropriately, the largest we've had. But that series has really been a game changer in the dialogue and evaluation for development in London. It's always attracted a large audience of government, civil society, and academia. 3IE and the colleges have had a wonderful relationship. We're starting next week our first short course in evaluation of development programs. And I hope very much that 3IE has benefited as much as our colleges have from this. Phil Davies and his team are very much a part of our academic community now, and leading that forward. But I'd like to make a special thanks to Howard for starting this valuable relationship that we have. But I'm not here to introduce Howard tonight because there are others who are going to do that. I'd like to hand over now to our two co-chairs for this evening's lecture to introduce Howard. Annette Brown is Deputy Director of 3IE and Head of 3IE's Washington office. Richard Manning is Chair of the 3IE Board. I'm going to hand over now to Annette.
Good evening. I should say I'm one of our 5 deputy directors of 3IE and also head of the Washington office. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see you all here tonight. So this is not only going to be a great lecture by Howard White, but the inaugural lecture in the new 3IE Howard White Lecture Series. Back in April, when the board was in Washington, the senior management and some members of the board conceived the idea of establishing an annual lecture series, not to memorialize Howard, because of course he's still very much with us, and not just with us, but will, I think, be with us at 3IE and in the communities that we're in and the activities that we do. So certainly not that, but rather to celebrate not just the impact that Howard has had on this organization, but the impact through 3IE that he's had on evidence-informed policymaking and a culture around impact evaluation and systematic reviews around the world. So this lecture series will be annual. This first one is a little bit off schedule. So from now on, they will actually occur in the spring in conjunction with our annual members conference and our board meeting. So the next annual, or the 2015 3IE Howard White Lecture, will happen in April of 2015. And we hope in the next couple months we'll be able to announce who that speaker will be. So we forgot to tell you, Howard, that when we named it this, it didn't mean we were going to bring you back every year to give a lecture. But hopefully we can bring you back every year to attend the lecture. Now, one of the things that Howard is famous for in his talks is wonderful little nuggets that people love to quote later. And in case you have a burning desire to quote it immediately on Twitter, I have been asked to point out and remind you that we have a hashtag for our Evidence Week, which is hashtag 3IE Evidence WK. So, with no further ado, I'm going to introduce my co-chair, Richard Manning, who, among many other prestigious roles, is the chair of 3IE's Board of Commissioners.
Thank you very much, Annette, and welcome to you all at this wonderful gathering, which is taking place just after the completion of 3IE's semi-annual board meeting, at which we have just been saying our thanks to Howard for the extraordinary role he's played as Executive Director of 3IE since its foundation. You all have with you what you've picked up already, the basic outline of Howard's very distinguished career in international development, in evaluation, in improving policies. What I want to say in a couple of minutes is that on top of that, Howard has played a totally extraordinary role in taking a concept to reality. He's created from nothing, from himself really, an organization which now has over 40 staff in 3 different offices, most of them in India, also here in London, also in Washington, as you've heard, which has commissioned a large number of impact evaluations, adding very significantly to what is known about a whole series of development interventions, has created a suite of instruments in the evaluation space which are increasingly being used by a larger collection of implementing countries, and several of our board members come from countries which have indeed been developing these approaches with support of 3IE and Howard personally, and has created a highly functioning and effective organization where there was nothing before. It's an extraordinary story, and we're very pleased as a board to be able to launch this new series, which will keep Howard's achievements right before us for the indefinite future. And we're even more pleased, Howard, that you can be here and launch this whole thing yourself. And I know from hearing you on other occasions that we're in for a very fascinating and memorable lecture. So I won't take any more of your time. Howard White.
Thank you, Richard, and Annette, and Jeff, and good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. A great pleasure to be giving this lecture. I find it a bit embarrassing to say the name. The lecture is entitled "Fieldwork is Easy with Eyes Closed, Misunderstanding All You See, and Other Reflections." So I didn't think I could speak for a whole 30 minutes or so on the one topic, so I decided to add in a few more. But I will speak a bit about this. So many years ago, actually, when I was still at secondary school, I decided to work in international development. That's what I wanted to do. And so I went off and did an undergraduate degree in development studies. And this was quite unusual at that time. There were only 3 places in the UK offered development studies degrees at that time. So I went off to the University of East Anglia and did a development studies bachelor's. During the course of that degree, which was an interesting course, but I realised that actually it wasn't equipping me with any skills that would make me employable in the job market and working in international development, which seemed to be a bit of a bother. So I looked around and thought, what would I like to do? And many of you will be familiar with the ODI, Overseas Development Institute Fellowship Scheme. And I thought, okay, that's what I'd like to do. The ODI scheme was started by the then ODA, now DFID in the late 60s, to take young graduates and put them in line positions in developing countries for a couple of years, so would get experience out in developing country ministries and agencies, and then would go back and work actually principally for ODA, now DFID at that time. At the point at which I was planning to apply in the mid-80s, early 80s, they had just changed from recruiting people coming out from bachelor's degrees to recruiting people with master's degrees. So I thought, okay, I'll have to go into a master's degree before I can apply to be an ODI fellow. So I actually wrote to ODI and said, well, look, I can go and do something like Southern African Studies at the University of York, which sounds really interesting. I can go and do an economics master's, which sounds really boring, to be honest. Which do you think I should do? And they wrote back, surprisingly, saying, we advise you to do an economics degree, because that's how you get a job in development. So I went off to London School of Economics and did my master's, and I applied for the ODI fellowship scheme. And sure enough, around February time or something, they invited me for an interview in Percy Street, just a couple of blocks from here. So I went for the interview. It was quite a competitive process. The guy that went in before me came out very red and sweaty and shaking. So I thought, okay, this is going to be fun. So I went in, and the first question I got asked by Tony Killock, who was director of ODI at the time and well known for his work on the IMF and stabilisation programmes in Africa. And Tony's first question was, "Oh, I see you did a development studies degree at East Anglia. Don't you think that was rather a waste of time?" So my reply to that was, well, actually, no. I'm not sure what people who do economics for an undergraduate degree do with all that time. How can you spend 3 years studying economics? It's just taken me 9 months. So, and that was apparently the right answer, because I got the job. But what I do still stand by is that the development studies degree that I had, I'm very glad to see Chris Edwards up here as one of my lecturers all those years ago, and he actually looks younger than me now. I don't know how he manages that. Is that what I learned in development studies degree all those years ago still stands me in good stead. And actually, as an economist with a multidisciplinary background, I managed to do field work with my eyes open, which really most economists seem not to do. And I will attempt to give some examples of that. There's a few books I think should be required reading for anyone practicing development. And one of them is Polly Hill's Development Economics on Trial. It came out in, I think, 83 or something. So Polly Hill actually trained as an economist at Cambridge under Joan Robinson, but then went on to pursue a more anthropological career. And in Development Economics on Trial, she takes apart some of the key economic concepts that economists typically use, like the household. So economists typically construct household rosters in their surveys, assuming that households operate like a Western nuclear family, which simply isn't true. And so they miss out on many of the exchange relationships that take place in intra-household relationships in, say, West Africa, where Polly Hill does her work. In West Africa, women control their own land. If their husband works on that land, she pays him a wage for doing so. Something that most questionnaires would fail to capture because they don't understand that form of intra-household relationship. And Polly Hill starts this book with what she calls a long preamble regarding a programme by the Cocoa Marketing Board in the then Gold Coast, back in the 1950s, Ghana, before it became independent. Now, the central thesis from this programme she looked at was that debt is bad. Many farmers, cocoa farmers, were indebted to evil moneylenders in the villages. And so what they needed to do to help these farmers be productive and invest productively was to free them up from these loans, this debt, so they could actually then take back possession of their farms, not be under the burden of this debt, and therefore become more productive farmers. And so they went out with this scheme, and the officers of the Cocoa Marketing Board would go out and they would have a farmer, the person who's indebted, and the debt holder, the creditor, come before them and sign a legal document stating the amount of the debt. And then the officer from the Cocoa Marketing Board would say, OK, I've assessed the debt. I'm going to pay you this much money to write down the debt. So that money goes to the creditor. The debt's now been paid off. The farm reverts to the farmer. Actually, it belongs to the Cocoa Marketing Board. So the original farmer has paid back the debt to us, but now only a rate of 2 or 3% rather than the 15 or 20% the moneylender was charging. When Polly Hill did her work on this programme, she discovered that, for a start, people in the villages in Gold Coast did not think debt was bad. They thought debt was normal. You incur debt, and that's to be expected. Most of the people they incurred the debt from were their friends. And when they went and redeemed the debt, they didn't actually change the nature of the relationship at all. They shared the money between them, and they still considered the debt had to be repaid to the creditor by the farmer. And most importantly of all, the vast majority of the claims they assessed were fraudulent. The farmers quickly worked out, we just need to get together, find someone to write a legal notice that we have this debt together, which doesn't exist, and we can go and get this money from the Cocoa Board. So 90% or more of these claims were fraudulent. Now, you can imagine anyone who, say, a district administrator going out and assessing this programme would have done a report just like you see today being done for the EU or DFID or so on. Our terms of reference asked us to do this. We inspected these documents. We visited 5 villages. And this programme is doing a good job of freeing farmers of evil of debt. And they wouldn't have spotted at all that most of the claims were fraudulent, because they'd be doing their field work with their eyes closed. And you see this again and again and again. So why is it that economists can't see what actually is blindingly obvious to people that go around and do their field work with their eyes open? I will give some examples of where I think I've succeeded in using additional information to inform evaluations. I've written several papers on mixed methods, and these are commonly criticised because they say you make it sound like you just go out and look at stuff yourself. Now, I think that critique is wrong. I think there's a wide range of mixed methods that should be used, using a lot of qualitative methods, including focus groups. I think focus groups are overemphasised, but transects, poverty mapping, oral life histories, I think are really great. I'm a big fan of oral life histories. But a lot of it is actually just going out and looking yourself what is happening. One of my colleagues at ISS in The Hague, when I was there, Carl Janssen, used to say, you can always tell when someone's written a paper and they've never been to the country. Yes? It just tells. It shows when you read it. And there are many studies you read where you think, well, they've never been to the country, or they've not actually been out in that area. If they did, they didn't really see what was going on. So here's an example where I think I did manage to see what was going on. So, a couple of points about rural electrification in Laos. So, before I was at 3i years at the World Bank in the evaluation department, and we're doing a study of rural electrification. And one of the puzzles I want to look at was to explain which communities were connected to the grid. Now, if you've done impact evaluation, you know that selection interview intervention is a very important part of the evaluation design, so you need to know which communities and which households connect to the grid. And basically, rural electrification programs, grid extension programs, you'll get these high voltage cables. They're the big pylons you see that come from the point of generation or import of electricity that go across the country in more or less a straight line. They're the big pylons, boom, boom, boom. And they go into regional provincial capitals where you build a substation that stores the energy, and then you run medium voltage cables along the line of road, and when you pass near enough to a community, say 5 or 10 kilometres from the road, where people are well enough off to afford the connection charge, then you run the medium voltage cable off the road into that community, low voltage cables go into the households to connect the village, individual households in the village. Pretty standard way of doing rural electrification. So I had a rural electrification data set from a World Bank project in Laos. I'd never been to Laos at this point. And I was trying to work out which villages should be connected. And you would think that distance to provincial capital, distance to road, average wealth in the village would be pretty good predictors. And they weren't particularly. The R squared was only around 60%, which is quite low, and a lot of its significance was coming from the 2 ethnic dummies. There are 3 main ethnic groups in Laos, and two of them, particularly one in the central belt, going north-south, but also the one in the far east, which actually the more marginalised ethnic group, was also more connected than the main ethnic group over on the western side of the country. It's a bit of a puzzle. Why can't I explain it, and why are these ethnic dummies so large? So I went to Laos, and after spending some time in the capital of Vientiane, I went on a field trip down to the south, a place called Champasak. And they took me out to a place called 4,000 Islands, where there are lots of islands in 4,000 Islands. And we went to visit a village to visit an off-grid electrification program, solar panels. And so we drove out of the town about 10 kilometres down this road, and there were the medium voltage cables by the road, down a feeder road, there are the medium voltage cables, into the village. And you see all the households are connected. We then went to some households in the same village, 200 metres away, that were not connected to the grid. Half the households in this village were not connected to the grid, and the other half were. Which seems like a big puzzle until you realise the half that weren't were on an island in the Mekong River. And you can't run the grid across the river. It's not cost effective. So we went on a boat and went to these households in the river and on the island that had solar panels. So it turns out if you live on an island or behind a mountain, you're not likely to have grid electricity because it's not cost effective to get it there. The amazing thing is that the people who designed this questionnaire on rural energy in Laos did not ask, is your community, or in the community questionnaire didn't ask, is your community on an island or behind a big mountain? Because they actually affect quite a lot your sources of energy. And this was a rural energy survey. So it seems that the people who designed the survey had either never been outside of Vientiane or they hadn't opened their eyes. Because there are a lot of islands in 4,000 islands. You can't avoid it. Yes, there are a lot of islands there. People live on islands and they don't have the grid. It's just a very obvious determinant. But there's another key thing. There are 20 odd or so households on this island, and 12 of the households were empty. So I asked, well, what's happened to these households? And they told me, well, they still own their land here and they come each day to farm here. It takes a couple of minutes to cross the river. But they've moved their main house to the mainland because, this is really key, location is endogenous respective intervention. Households move to get near facilities. So it's, even in Africa, whole villages move to get near better facilities. So often when we design impact evaluations, we assume, oh, in comes the grid, that's an exogenous intervention, we can just do our regression or our double differencing. It's not true, because location is endogenous. This is, I think, a fairly important insight when designing impact evaluations. It's one trip spent in the morning outside of Champasak, going down to this place and seeing this. But I think it's a universal insight. So you can generalise from small pieces of qualitative information. I don't think people are going to get a lot of people nodding, no one's saying, no, location is never endogenous. Not true. It clearly is true. But I've seen study after study where it's assumed location is, that the intervention is exogenous to location. And it really is not so. Second example, a slightly longer one, are social funds in Malawi and Zambia. Now, social funds in Malawi and Zambia were precursors of the community-driven development. This is an evaluation I did back in the late 1990s, again for the World Bank. And the social funds there in Malawi and Zambia at this time were using basically a community-driven development model. What that means is the community has to come together and identify a community project. The community then has to apply to the district to get funding to conduct this community project. The funding is paid into a bank account held by the community, who then pay a private contractor to do most of the construction, but there's a required community contribution where the community has to make bricks and bring building sand to construct the building, mostly schools. In Zambia in particular, 90% of these things they did were schools, other 10% were health clinics. Malawi a bit more mixed, but still majority were schools. Now, the theory of change behind social funds at this time was that social funds would help build social cohesion, or social capital, as it was called at the time. So the idea is that by working together on this community project, communities would learn to work together, and so after having done one project funded by the social fund, they would go on to other projects which they would initiate and undertake themselves. Okay, so that's the idea. We found something different in our quantitative data. It was true, if you look at the left-hand bars, large percentages of households, close to 90% of households we interviewed in a representative household survey in 30 communities, said, yes, some of my household went and took part in making bricks or bringing building sand from the river up to the site where the school was built. But only around half were aware a community meeting took place in which that project was selected. And only around a third attended that meeting, and less than, down around 10-15% actually spoke at the meeting. There's only around 5% for women. So there's people participate in making bricks, but not in making decisions. So what was going on there? Again, visiting a number of communities, it was 17 in Zambia and a dozen in Malawi, a very clear picture emerged about the way these programs actually worked on the ground. And it was not to do with big community meetings, deciding on the intervention and going together and doing the intervention. What actually happened was that typically a head teacher would come to a village, and the head teacher would see that the school was broken down, run down. When I said they built schools, they didn't normally build new schools, they rehabilitated schools, which meant actually knocking down the existing school and building a new classroom block. So the head teacher would come and he would see that the school was a mess, all run down, dilapidated, and so on. Often schools were just sticks with thatched structures, so they weren't very strong anyway, or just corrugated iron or something like this. Now the head teacher knew about the social fund. He knew about it because they built 1,600 new schools in 5 years. So he may well have come from a school that had a benefit from the social fund, or he had a friend who had told him about it, or he'd just seen the things. You don't have to drive very far to see one of these blue and white social fund schools in Zambia in the early 2000s. Or most importantly, the social fund actually used the head teachers' conference as one of their main dissemination channels. So the head teachers knew about it. The head teacher was very keen to do this. The school he was going to teach in was a mess, but more importantly, they didn't only rehabilitate the school, they built teacher housing with solar panels. So the teacher could choose between living literally in a mud hut or in a brick building with solar power. So it's a bit of a no-brainer as far as the teacher is concerned. One head teacher said to us, when I first came here, I sat down and cried when I saw the house I'd have to bring my wife and children to live in. So he really had a big incentive to do something about applying to his social fund to have a new school built. Now, there's another key advantage for the head teacher. In the words of one head teacher, to do this project to work, you need someone who's not afraid to enter offices. It's a really powerful expression, someone not afraid to enter offices. We forget how ordinary people are intimidated by authority. These guys, they're afraid to enter offices. They're not going to go to the district capital and ask for a form and fill it in. These guys can't keep the project accounts. You need that for this sort of programme to work. Who can do that? The head teacher, the deputy head. So the head teacher wants a thing, he has the skills required and the political capital. He knows the people in the district education office. They're his colleagues. They're mostly ex-teachers. He knows them. He goes there to get his salary every month. So he can go and he can make this happen. What he can't make happen is mobilise the community. He's a foreigner. He's not from that village. A foreigner in local language meaning not from the village. He's an outsider, a stranger. So he goes to the village headman and he says to them, we can build a new school. Great. All we need to do is get the community together to come and make bricks. So they call a community meeting. There is a community meeting. It takes place. And at that community meeting, they don't say, oh, what do you want to build? They say, we're going to build a school. And every village has to make 20,000 bricks. So your village, on Mondays, every household in your village has to send one able-bodied person to come and make bricks. On Tuesdays, you're going to come. Wednesdays, you're going to come. And so on. And you're going to keep coming until we've made our quota of 400,000 bricks or whatever it is. And if you don't send someone, we're going to fine you a chicken. This is actually, if you go back and read, for example, Robert Wade's work on irrigation in South India, this is precisely how these programs ought to work. They utilise existing social structures. They don't create new parallel committees and some sort of fake election to vote people to a new project committee. They utilise the existing traditional structures that exist in African villages, certainly in Malawi and Zambia, to mobilise community labour for community projects. And it works. It worked in building 1,600 new schools in rural areas, teacher housing, getting money out into rural areas to create infrastructure in a way a centralised project never would have done. So for creating physical infrastructure, these programmes were great. What they failed to do was build social capital. There's no surprise. Now, these study findings were very unpopular with the World Bank staff in charge of social funds, and indeed the World Bank staff in Malawi and Zambia. They believed very strongly in what I call the hippie model of social funds. The hippie model is everyone sits in a big circle and all decides on what project they want, and they all get together and build the bricks together and all build the house together. It doesn't work like that. It's not surprising it doesn't work like that. But if you ask them, who decides? Who manages the project? They always say, oh, the community manages the project. The community decides. Well, we were speaking to a social fund officer up in northern Zambia. Not this guy, I found this guy on Google, but some guy like this. Anyway, and we're talking to him, he answered his phone, and he said, okay, I have to go now. I have a community in my office. But he didn't mean I have a community in my office. He meant I have 4 people. I have the project committee in my office. The project committee being 1 or 2 of the headmen, the head teacher, the deputy head, and some retiree. So they saw the community as being represented by the project committee. And when I said the project decided, the community decided, they really meant the project committee decided. So these experiences in these 17 villages in Zambia and 12 in Malawi gave a very consistent narrative. There were some exceptions, but you do a nice coding matrix of these villages, which I did, to get a systematic review of the qualitative data. It comes out very clearly. This is the dominant narrative that you get. Head teacher comes in, head teacher decides want to do this, gets the village headman to mobilise the community, and there you get the school built. Zero social capital being built as a result of that, but a lot of new skills being built. At 3IE we've commissioned recent studies of a project in DRC, another Sierra Leone, CDD interventions, very similar findings. These projects create physical infrastructure, but don't create social capital. So it appears that the community, the program officers were so either blinded by the ideology or just went to the field not seeing what was really happening. For some reason, when you first go and you ask someone, oh, who decided on the project, they tell you the community. But you don't have to probe very much at all to find out the story that I heard consistently across all these villages. Okay, reflection 2. What goes around comes around. There's a lot of faddism in development policy, and that means we ought to be able to actually learn from the past. And the current focus on evidence actually is undermining our ability to learn from the past. Because some people out there, and there's some in this audience, believe if it's not randomised, you can't learn anything from it. 3IE doesn't believe that randomised controlled trials are the only valid source of knowledge, and there are many sources of knowledge about development programmes over the last 50, 60 years or longer that we should be learning from. When I was at the World Bank, the first study I did was education in Ghana, looking at the reforms that started in the late 70s, supported by the World Bank through the 80s, the late 80s as reform started, supported by the World Bank in the 90s and early 2000s. But as the subtitle for this talk says, I believe in going deep on context. So in preparing for the evaluation, I did read around the history of education in West Africa and in Ghana specifically, which helped inform the context for development primary education. The reforms that we looked at, the World Bank supported in the late 80s, had first been mooted in the 1970 by an education committee in Ghana in 1970. It took them 20 years to get a political party with the political guts, basically, that Rawlings had to force through these very unpopular reforms that he undertook. But anyway, it's another story. This book has this very nice quote. In the 1920s, teachers were paid according to exam results. That they focused on, and that's led teachers to focus on teaching to the test rather than developing the whole child and things more relevant to the child's development. But we know better now, and such policy has been long abandoned. Well, that's odd, because if you go to the website of Education World, which is connecting educators to what works, they tell us there are hundreds of districts in the US who have performance pay plans just like this. Indeed, it's mandatory in many states to have pay for performance for primary school teachers. So what goes around comes around, and we probably ought to be learning something about what we learned last time it came around, why it worked or didn't work. Let's take some more recent examples. So the Colonial Development Welfare Act, I can only find this one from 1940. Google sucks at finding old photos. The first Colonial Development Act was in 1922, but there are subsequent acts that became Colonial Development Welfare Act by 1940s. And there's a lot of colonial development programmes long before there was a British aid programme. Here's an example. OK, let's do an innovative programme. Let's go round and show people videos and films in the villages. They were doing that in the 1940s. Yes, there's nothing new comes out of Africa or goes into Africa from aid donors. Now, let's come back to this in a moment. Community development movement. This was a big movement. It started in the 1920s and 30s in French and British colonies in Africa. And I couldn't find the photos on Google, but when I was at the World Bank, they had some very nice books from the 40s with photos of colonial administrators going out and sitting in circles with villagers doing participatory planning exercises. And immediately in the 1940s, it spread to India. And by the 1960s, 60 countries around the world had community development programs funded by USAID, and virtually every village in India had a community development program, which looked like this. They formed community groups to identify community projects. They had village-level facilitators to help the community groups form these groups. They provided district-level technical support staff like veterinarians, vets and agricultural extension workers. And they undertook community-led projects. So this was going on in the 1950s. Big time, up to around the mid-60s. Unfortunately, as many reviews of these projects showed, they failed because of elite capture. So basically, what was done in the name of the community actually benefited the elite of the community because the facilitators identified with the elite. They actually became friends with the elite. The things they could identify to be done were essentially private goods that would benefit the elite and so on. Let's move forward 50 years. And I'm being asked to look at something called the Andhra Pradesh Rural Livelihoods Programme. And what does it do? It forms community groups to identify community projects. It has village-level facilitators. It provides district-level technical support staff. And they undertake community-led projects. And it failed because of elite capture. When I first saw this project, I said, but isn't this community development projects? And one guy said, yeah, oh yes, I remember those. It sounds a bit like that. And when I described it to people, when I was doing evaluation, I would say, if you want to design a project to be subject to elite capture, then this is it. Because, just to go into detail a bit, this is a rural livelihoods project. DFID is very big on livelihoods. And they have a livelihoods framework designed, for instance, by Ian Scroons at IDS. You may be familiar with the diagram. And so, they form self-help groups of women in the villages in Andhra Pradesh. A self-help group, we'll meet them again later, is a group of 10 or 12 women. And each woman in the group had to make her own livelihood plan, according to DFID standards for livelihood plans. Based on these 12 livelihood plans, they would make a self-help group livelihood plan. Then all the self-help groups would come together in something called the VIVO, the Village Committee, chaired by the VIVO president, but the members were the chairs for separate self-help groups. And based on the individual self-help group livelihood plans, they would make a village livelihood plan. And they would take their village livelihood plans to the district level, where all the VIVO chairs would meet, and make a district level livelihood plan. All based on the village livelihood plans, based on the self-help group livelihood plans, based on the individual livelihood plans of illiterate women in Andhra Pradesh. Now, I actually can't do a DFID livelihood plan very well. I doubt, to be honest, illiterate women in Andhra Pradesh can do so either. And they knew that. So when they formed their self-help groups, they would get together, and we have evidence of this, and say, oh, I don't know about this livelihood plan business. I don't really know which way is up on that. So why don't we ask Mrs. B? Mrs. B finished primary school. Ask her to come and chair our self-help group. So you had a system where you created self-help groups which were chaired by more educated women from higher castes. What does that lead to? That leads to elite capture. Actually, it led to systematic fraud. What we found in village after village, I mean every single village we went to, was that people had been told, okay, I applied for a loan for 2,000 rupees. A year later I go back and say, I must have paid my loan by now, can I take a second loan? And I was told, no, you didn't borrow 2,000 rupees, you borrowed 5,000 rupees. And you better pay back the rest or we're going to seize your assets. So the self-help group chairs were actually taking 5,000 rupees against that person's name. They kept the pay books, not the individuals, and only given them 2,000. And the other 3,000 was shared amongst the self-help group chairs, the NGOs, the government officials in charge of signing off the programme and so on. We heard this in every single village we went to. As one NGO leader said, you introduce one rupee into a village, you start conflict. And there were indeed people killed in villages in conflict over these project resources. So this really was a programme that was set up to suffer military capture. And they'd done exactly the same thing 50 years earlier. And it's well documented. You didn't need a randomised controlled trial to know that project wasn't going to work. OK, let's move on. Millennium Villages, there's a good idea. An integrated package of services to deliver clusters of villages. Based on interventions, according to Jeff Sachs, that we know work. So there's nothing to evaluate. But funnily enough, in the 1970s and 80s, we did integrated rural development projects that delivered integrated package of services delivered to clusters of villages. Exactly the same design. And there's more photos of some. A 1988 review of rural development supported by the World Bank said that IRDPs, about 80% of them failed. And they failed because they used over-rigid blueprint designs, they didn't adapt using local technologies, and the agencies were unable to coordinate or implement multiple interventions in one go. IRDPs reviewed by the bank gave around $800 per person back in the 70s. So comparable or more than MVP is putting into villages now. Identical programme design. MVP is in no way different to IRDPs from the 70s and 80s. So when we are supporting the evaluation, we're doing quality assurance for evaluation done by IDS and ITAD of Millennium Villages, financed by DFID. We were discussing it yesterday at our session yesterday, and I said afterwards to someone, I think even when they get to endline, they'll find no impact. And they said, well, how can you find no impact with so much money going in? There's historical precedent for the same thing. If you go in immediately after the money's gone, you might find something, but the fact is with IRDPs, you'd go back 5 years later and there was nothing left. Nothing to show for it. And there's no reason to think MVPs will be any different. Okay, iterate theory and data and mix your methods. This is, I think, quite a short one. And ignore beneficial perspectives with more peril than ignoring history. Let's talk about self-help groups. Again, so this is self-help groups in Andhra Pradesh. First thing is about validating data. So when we started this study, we were told by the World Bank, who was also supportive of self-help groups, 80 to 90% of women in Andhra Pradesh, in rural areas, are members of self-help groups. And it's going to be 100% soon. We did a representative household survey in 2005. It was around 50%. Went back 2 years later, it had fallen to 40%. So it was much less than they said, it was going down, not up. Now the monitoring data was saying 80, 90%. So how can we explain that difference? If you're going to come with a study and you're going to say to an implementing agency, the World Bank or DFID, you're wrong about those numbers, you should be able to explain the discrepancy. And again, this discrepancy is very easy to explain. You just need to go to a village and talk to someone. So we'd go to the villages, and when you start your survey, you have to go and sit and meet the elders, the village leaders, the sarpanch and the village secretary and so on. And you sit in the veranda of the veranda of the house of one of these people, and you talk about the village and so on. And when you come on self-help groups, they would typically say something like, oh yes, we have 17 self-help groups in our village, of which 11 are functioning. In other words, self-help groups were formed, but many of them after 2 or 3 years stopped functioning. The monitoring data only recorded group formation. It didn't record group dissolution. So the numbers in the 80-90% were all the people who ever joined self-help groups. Whereas we're asking, are you actually in a self-help group now? So the accurate number of people in a self-help group now was 50% going down to 40%. Whereas if you just take a stock of all who ever joined, it was 90%, but that was the wrong number. So we can easily explain that. But there was a key insight I had from one encounter. Now, 3IE some years ago had a big conference in Cairo, and we asked a range of people to talk about impact evaluation designs for a range of interventions. And one of the people I cajoled and practically pushed onto the stage in the end was Robert Chambers to talk about participatory approaches to impact evaluation. And one of the things Robert said in that talk was, watch out for angry people. I think it's just good advice in general, you know. Yes, but he said, watch out for angry people, because if they're angry about something, and what they're angry about will tell you something. So we're in this village, and one of the numerals came up to me, and she said, you have to come and talk to this man. He's really, really angry. So I said, okay, I'll come meet this angry man. And why was he angry? He was angry because his daughter, who lived at home, which is in her early 20s, was a member of a self-help group, and she'd never got a loan. Now, these self-help groups were basically savings clubs, and the project put more money in through them so they could increase the number of loans they gave. But this woman had been in this group for 2 years and never got a loan. Seems unfair. I'd be angry if it was my daughter. Why hadn't she got a loan? She hadn't got a loan because her mother was also a member of the same self-help group. And the fact is that everyone in the village saw the loan as a loan to the household, not to the individual. That household already had a loan. The mother had a loan, actually had two. So there's no way they were going to give the daughter a loan as well. This one insight, this one angry man, led me back to the quantitative data we had collected and see a very clear pattern. Here you see a plot of the probability of joining a self-help group. Again, look at the bottom line only for 2007, against the number of eligible women in the household. Number of women aged between 18 and 55. And you see if there's only one woman in the household who's right age to join, around 40% do. But as soon as there are 2 or 3 women, then the probability halves. Because there's no point in them both joining the self-help group. Only one of them will get a loan. So this is a very clear example of a piece of qualitative information informing me to go back and pick out a variable in the quantitative data that I never thought of, as even possibly an identifying restriction that you might use in your impact evaluation. As another better one, but I'm not going to talk about that. Because it didn't occur to me, spoke to the man, it occurred to me, there's a very clear pattern in the data. I'll just say a bit more about self-help groups, and one of the key things, again, that Carl Janssen mentioned to me was you have to know if numbers are credible or not. Just when you see a number, think, is that number credible? Does it make sense? Now, the World Bank did a completion report for this project, and what the project financed with these small loans were women, self-help groups buying sheep and goats and cattle to make milk and for meat. And according to the World Bank project documents, buying sheep and cattle in Andhra Pradesh is an extremely good investment. What do you think is the rate of return from buying goats in Andhra Pradesh? I mean, do I buy a good investment? Do I mean 10% or 20% or even 50%? Actually, no. According to these World Bank documents, buying a goat in Andhra Pradesh has a return of 1,000%. So I'm going to put all my pension fund when I did 3i into goats in Andhra Pradesh. No arguing with me. I'm going to do it because it's such a good return. The only problem is it's wrong. And it's so obviously wrong, why would you believe that number? Why would you put it in a World Bank document? And the reason it's wrong is, what do goats do in Andhra Pradesh? They die. They die a lot. You buy a goat, it goes bleep, 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 bleh, over it goes. Goats die. And so you would meet self-help group of self-help group who had bought goats, the goats had died, there was no livestock insurance, they were actually in debt, they had to borrow money from money lenders to repay the debt back to the project. So large numbers of women were impoverished by this project, because they got bad advice on what to buy. And the fact is, if your goats don't die, you get a return of around 20 rupees a day, which is not bad, it's okay. If your goats die, you lose thousands. And so the 1 in 10 or so groups that lost everything, more than evens out with the few that gain a bit. So when you do your regression and you find there's no average impact, the average treatment effect from this project is 0, that's because there's a smaller number of losers who've lost a lot, who overcompensate or balance out the small numbers, larger number of winners who win a much smaller amount. Okay, so you need to look for heterogeneity here. This is what this is telling you. I mean, it tells you the World Bank numbers are wrong, but you need to look at heterogeneity. The people who have suffered the shock of losing their goats have lost a lot, and that outweighs the gain from those that have gained. Just the sort of information that you don't get if you just go in and collect your data, scurry back to your Ivory Town, analyse the data set. You need to have this level of knowledge to analyse heterogeneity in the data. this beneficiary perspective is what drives my belief in the funnel of attrition. If you've been here me before, you've heard me speak about the funnel of attrition, and this is the idea that basically the benefits from projects are far less than we imagine, because we overestimate the benefits and we underestimate the cost to beneficiaries. Actually, it is this woman. So this woman here, she was a leader of the one in red, the chair of a self-help group, and her self-group and another had got together and on the advice of the project staff had started a nursery, not for babies, for seedlings. And they gave them the fruit trees, and then they grew the fruit trees. They weren't allowed to sell the fruit trees, because they said, well, we gave you the fruit trees, so you can't sell them, you have to give them to local farmers. So the women actually paid to clear some land, they paid to hire machinery, and they paid for the chemicals. And they cleared the land partly manually, so they paid themselves also from the money they got from the self-help group a salary, a wage, for clearing the land. But of course their income was less than the value of the money they borrowed. And there was the money they got from the self-help group loan was less than the money they borrowed, so they had to pay some additional costs. And there was no revenue. So this project was obviously going to lose money. So when I asked the woman, are you going to do it again? She looked at me like I was a village idiot, because there's no way I'm going to do it again. I lost money on it. I told her it's a good idea, so I did it, but it's not a good idea. I'm not going to do it again. So people don't do things because they're not in their interest. That's very clear not in their interest. But there are many things we tell to people, oh, go and do this, it's a good project. They don't think it is a good project. So we ignore beneficiary perspectives at our peril because they don't have the same incentive structures we do or think they do. Empathy is a really important tool in the evaluation toolkit. You've got to think like the beneficiaries. Never be boring. That's good advice. So let's talk a bit about Wellington. There he is. Okay, so a couple of years ago, there's a memo that Wellington supposedly wrote, maybe it's apocryphal, doing the rounds. So there's a letter that Wellington wrote back to the War Office in London during the campaign in Spain. And he's writing to them in response to an earlier letter they had sent him, where he says, I've managed to account for all my supplies and so on, as you've requested. Unfortunately, I can't account for 3 jars of marmalade and 2 and 6pence from petty cash. So he says, OK, I want to ask you a question. You know, I'm sorry I can't account for the marmalade and the petty cash, but it may have escaped your notice we're actually at war with France. And that was distracting me a bit. So I want to ask you a question. Do you want me actually to account for all the marmalade, or do you want me to beat the French? Because I can't do both. So this memo was doing the rounds a couple of years ago as an argument against the movement towards monitoring and evaluation and the need for project staff to actually report on various project indicators. Now, there's a response to Wellington. If Wellington himself was going out and counting the marmalade, he was a dreadful micromanager. Yes, Wellington did need a management information system. Wellington needed to know, where are the French? I want to be there. Yes, what condition are their troops in? He needed certain information. He didn't need to bother himself about the marmalade. Yes, okay, 3IE consumes a certain number of paper clips each year. I've no idea how many, I don't care. Yes, but someone should care. Someone should be looking after that information, but not me. Yes, so there's a point here, that a serious point, is that we do need monitoring information. Different people need different information. But why I'm talking about Wellington is that earlier this year I was invited by the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda to go and speak to Cabinet. And they kept bothering me, send me your presentation, send me your presentation. And I don't do that really, and I do it on the day. So, but eventually I sent it, they wanted me to send it. So they wrote back saying, why is there a picture of Wellington in your presentation? We want to talk about monitoring and evaluation in Uganda. So I replied, do you want the Cabinet to notice me or not? I can go in and say, the government of Uganda has a world-class monitoring evaluation system widely regarded across Africa. It has 56 indicators in the water supply. It's very boring. Why would I do that? They would say, oh, thank you very much, now please go away. But I spoke about Wellington, I spoke about Gandhi. It was interesting. And I stayed there for 2 hours. Yes, and I did speak about monitoring and evaluation in Uganda. But you've got to be memorable. You've got to be boring. When I was at the World Bank, one thing I learned, I think, very clearly was how to write reports. Most reports that are commissioned by donors do start, Our terms of reference asked us to do this. We had an advisory group comprising of I don't care. It's not interesting. Put it in the annex. Start out the report by saying, you know, there are 90% of girls are subject to female genital mutilation. This project attempted to tackle that problem. Tell a story about it, someone who's been subject to it. Okay, get reader's attention, just like a novelist would. Brighton Rock, Hale knew before 3 hours he'd been in Brighton, they meant to kill him. I want to read that book. Yes, I don't want to read one if Graham Greene had started, oh, the publisher commissioned me to write a book about Brighton. Yes. So, don't be boring. Policy influence. Now, there's 3 I's what we say we do. We're improving lives for impact evaluation. So, I really had to pay much more attention to this than I have in the past. Though I've always tried to do in my career, it really is our focus now. The evidence-based development movement comes out of the evidence-based medicine movement, and we try to model ourselves a lot on that. But we have to realise the use of evidence in social policy and economic policy are different to the use of evidence in medicine. The uses of evidence in medicine are the medical profession. They're all very smartly dressed and sensible. I'm London School of Hygiene, what am I going to say? You know, they all greatly believe in medicine. The use of evidence in social policy are politicians who are far less amenable to rational argument. Nonetheless, you need to build relationships. Here you didn't expect a picture of cuddly banners. I just had to use it. So, it comes up with Google relationships, this is what you get. Don't ask me why. Don't want to go there. Okay, but this is a bit better. Okay, this one also comes up. Okay, so you need to build relationships, and that takes time. That's what policy influence is about. You need to become a trusted source of evidence. Okay, you need to be the person that people are going to go to ask for information. It really is very important. And that does take a long time. I used to work, it doesn't come out very well, I used to read work on macro policy reform and aid and so on back in the 1990s. Here's a book, Programmatic Conditionality, that I wrote. I got this picture from Amazon today. Very few people took their advice to look inside that book. I'm sorry to say. But what that research did show was that policy reform simply takes a long time and is frequently misdated. The World Bank used to date policy reform from when its adjustment loan started. But the reality was actually those reforms have been going on slowly in a more incremental manner for 2, 3, 4, 5 years beforehand. A common example is Vietnam. Reform in Vietnam is commonly dated from Doi Moi in 1983. The truth is, the South was never collectivised in the first place. And reforms in the industrial sector started in 1978, 5 years before Doi Moi. So reforms just take a long time. They take place over a much longer time than people commonly recognise. One of the other books, I'm not advertising that book, I'm advertising this book. So Juan Haidan, I think it's Swedish, I can't say it properly, wrote 2 very influential books back in the 80s. Well, one influential book. The influential book was called Beyond Ujamaa. It's a critique of Ujamaa in Tanzania. And the second book, which is much more important, I think, and should be read by everyone, No Shortcuts to Progress, talks a lot about the importance of incrementalism in social policy. There are very few big bangs out there, okay, and where they've been, they're usually not terribly successful. The reality is social policy change is normally a much more incremental, experiential, experimental approach. It's how we run through IE. We try things out, they work, we modify them, don't work, we modify them, and so on. And it's the way social policy would normally proceed as well. Bit of incrementalism, bit of experimentation. Don't be over-ambitious. So this is very much against blueprint approaches like IDRPs or Millennium Villages. Be much more modest in the way you do things. That does speak in favour of the way development policy is being informed by evidence-based development trials, because we do it on a fairly smaller scale. Okay. Finally, final reflection. You can make a difference. So as I said, I came into this profession very many years ago, wanting, of course, to make a difference. And the metaphor I think is appropriate there comes from Jean-Paul Sartre. So in the Roads to Freedom trilogy, in the third book, Iron in the Soul, in case you're not familiar with it, and amazingly, young people today don't read Sartre. I don't know what's wrong with them. They're all on can't get it on their eye thingies. So, anyway, so there was an existentialist, but the Road to Freedom is about the fight against fascism. And so Matteo, the main character Matteo, it's all about his personal realisation and his role in the fight against fascism. And in Iron in the Soul, the third book, he ends up on top of a church tower, where a small group of French fighters are fighting off the Nazi advance. And basically he starts thinking, if I can hold back the Germans, the Nazis, for 15 minutes, then I've made my contribution. Okay? And it's true, there are many cases in many battles where someone holding back an advance for 10-15 minutes makes a decisive difference. And so the point is, we're going to change the world, we're going to end poverty. What you might do yourself is your 15 minutes on top of the church tower holding back the advance of fascism. It's a tiny thing, but it's the tiny things that we all do that add up to realising the dream of a world without poverty. So you can make a difference. And the things you do make a difference. They won't seem like very much in themselves, but it's the collective actions of all of us doing the small things that add up to the big thing. So I do believe what we do is important. And I do believe the way in which we do is important. We do it with commitment. We do it with belief that we believe in a world with more justice and less poverty. And we do it believing that actually research and evaluation is the way to do that. So maybe ending in one story. Back when I went to East Anglia, I spent a year there. I chose East Anglia because it actually had an agrarian option where you could learn natural resource management, and I thought that's what I'd do. I'd go to developing countries and working in projects. But after a year there, I realised, no, I want to work in policy, because it's policy where you make the big difference. In a single project, you affect 100 people. You affect policy, you affect thousands or millions. And I decided also to work on policy. I wanted to go on and be an academic, a researcher. So my father, who was very opposed to the whole idea of working in development anyway, said to me, I'm very surprised you want to do research on poor people rather than actually help them. But I believed then, and I believe still today, that doing research on poor people, for poor people, on behalf of poor people, is actually the most help you can give them. Because there are still billions and billions of dollars being wasted on programs that don't work after Jeff Sachs is doing it. Yes? So we can stop that. Okay, we can stop that through good quality research. And it's our responsibility to do so. And I hope this talk and the other talks I've given in the past here in this room will give you some insights on how to do so. Thank you.